Good. Okay. So it's good. It's a small group. We can have lots of discussion, hopefully, and tell me whether this is helpful or not. This is a topic that I sort of struggled with. Just let me. So can you all see that? Is that on full screen for you?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay. And what happens if I do that?
Yeah.
So sorry, I just want to put it on presenter show. Okay, good. Right, let's go. Right, thank you everybody for coming. As I said, this has been a tricky, well, probably a trippy topic as well as a tricky topic for me to get my head around and sort of distinguish it as a sort of a construct separate from some of the other constructs. Particularly, thank you for letting that person in. Particularly from relationships as well. So I also have relationships and support in this sort of quadrant, and I'll go through that. Remember that, yeah, you don't have to take, please don't take anything that that I say as being gospel in any way. Please go away and do your own research, but there are you know, references and things in here that you can go and sort of deep dive a little bit further in on all of this stuff. So this is part of a series of sessions. We've got the building capability for organisational change next week, Wednesday the 3rd, where I will be going over the whole model that I've built, and this is one segment of that model, which I'll come on to in a second. And there are other segments that I'm covering in these talks. We've already done trust in leadership, fairness, psychological safety. We're doing organisational support, we're doing relationships the week after next, and then we're doing resilience sometime, I think, at the end of August. So yeah, what I'm doing, I guess, is I've got all the theory that supports all of these different segments in the model, but I'm just trying to sort of socialise them and talk them through and see whether my reason for including them is coherent, and whether the model as a whole is kind of coherent. So this is the model, and it consists of two different perspectives. The sort of drive to flourish, the sort of uniqueness, autonomy that we seek in our organisations and in change as well. So expressing ourselves, but also that we want to belong to something bigger, and we understand that, you know, we're working for an organisation, and there's a psychological contract there, and that's primarily what we're touching on today. This idea of social exchange within those organisational relationships, and the part that or the role that plays within organisational change and support for organisational change. And then the other dimensions are these sort of being, which is the if you watch the neuroscience session, that's the sort of sensing side, that we are, you know, sort of sensing what's going on around us, that sort of internal introspective sort of perspective. And then there's the doing, we go out and act on the world, both as individuals and as part of groups and organisations as well. And, you know, we sort of listen to that feedback, and then that affects our sort of sensory information. So there's that sort of loop there between being and acting on our environment. And then we break it down into these four quadrants. So the author of my life is an individual, internal I perspective of the world. The top right hand side, the unleashing potential, is myself acting on the world, which is the sort of me perspective, which is objective, so people can see me doing my stuff. The I is, you know, subjective, it's how I feel. And then there's the bottom right, which is how we act on the world as a whole group. So our behaviours, you know, summarises sort of a group or organisational level. And then there's the group belonging perspective, which is intersubjective, which is the views that we have of others in the organisation. And this is where this element comes in. So we talked about psychological safety fits in with this because it's about how we perceive our relationships with others. I think organisational fairness sits in there because it's about how we perceive people's behaviours and feeling towards the decision-making process. Today we're going to talk about organisational support, and then we're going to talk about those more dyadic relationships that we have with our supervisors and people within our teams. So I'll dive into that in a bit more depth. And this is just sort of saying, you know, if we can start to understand the interrelationship between these different elements, then we can start to understand what our strategy is and create a sort of a narrative around how we are going to manage the change process and which capabilities we need to dial up and dial down. And within the model, you know, people get to choose which capabilities they think are important, which ones they think the organisation is good at, and then we can understand the interrelationships as well. And by taking those sort of three perspectives, then I think we can build a strong case for which bits of capability we should be building. So this is the session. So why is it important? What is it? How can we affect it? And then just a very quick summary of kind of what we'll see. I've tried to summarize the behaviors, which I found useful in management training in these sessions, to sort of say, look, if you're getting it right, then these are the sort of behaviors that you will see. So let's go into the why. So you know, it seems to be that organisational support, or perceived organisational support, which is primarily what we're talking about, and that is a you know, a construct within organisational development and psychology, and what I've struggled with on this, I guess, is the fact that it's not like psychological safety, which is very clearly defined and kind of sits on its own in a way. And organisational fairness is very well defined and kind of sits on its own. Although it does sort of draw in this idea of social exchange, which underpins a lot of you know, theory around organisational development and organisational change. But organisational support is a bit more, I found a bit more difficult to pin down. But it is a driver of commitment to organisational change. We'll go on to that. In terms of the management relationship, the leader, what's called leader member exchange, and we'll talk about that in the relationship session, because that's a sort of a dyadic relationship. That's a one-on-one relationship rather than a one-on organisation type relationship, and I'll just explain what I mean by that later. But it is there is a strong emphasis on the relationship that we have with our managers as we go through change, but we'll talk about that, as I say, in the relationship session. You know, it's critical for psychosocial well-being. So if I feel the organisation is going to support me, maybe when I fall over, and that doesn't have to be maybe psychologically, but you know, if I'm not getting things right, or I'm struggling with my job, or I'm struggling with the change, then if I know the organisation is going to support me when that happens, then I'm more likely to be able to feel that I can bounce back, and that sort of avoids you know, psychological burnout. And team effectiveness depends on the organisational context as well. So if we have these trusting relationships and there's strong social cohesion, then we know that teams will perform, and that's a much stronger indicator of whether teams perform than their actual composition, i.e. whether people have high IQs or not, or whether they're from the same background or not. So it's the context which is key, and we touched on that within the psychological safety session that we did. This really key one as well, which I think is so important for organisational change, which is not mentioned very much, is this concept of organisational citizenship behaviour. And you know, people working or contributing discretionary effort towards the change, so going the extra mile to make the change happen. And there is a counter side to that as well, which are behaviours that undermine the change process, which in normal, I guess, organisational change parlance, we call that resistance. So we'll talk about that and whether they are sort of at the other end of the scale. And yeah, people could just turn off their microphones, that'd be great. There's a bit just joined. Can everybody just turn off their mics because there's quite a bit of feedback. Is that? Yep, good, brilliant, thank you. That's gone now. And then the other bit that we'll touch on as well is the sort of help to change in a virtual world as well. So a lot of us are obviously conducting change in a virtual world. So this is the research that I sort of carried out. I used a book by Reconsidering Change Management, Applying Evidence-Based Insights into Change Management, which is Stephen Ten Have. Try to rank these key change management assumptions which are out there, and then I sort of asked practitioners whether they agreed with it, and then you can see this practitioner rating versus the academic rating, and you can see that both academics and practitioners both think that what's called here supervisory support, and that's more of the relationship, the dyadic relationship piece, is really important. And I'm sort of extrapolating that a bit and sort of saying, well, that probably applies to organisational support as well, although they didn't specifically look at perceived organisational support. Other evidence, this is the theory of planned behaviour by Arzam, which is, you know, a fairly well tested behavioural change model, and you can see that support is there. So if people see other people within the organisation supporting others through change, and they feel that they're going to get support and they get opportunities to experiment with their behaviours, knowing that they're not going to be pulled over if they make a mistake, which is the whole sort of psychological safety piece as well, then that's a key driver for people feeling confident that they can have a go at changing their behaviours. So it ties into that. It also ties into the COM-B model, which is seems to me like a sort of a more recent updated version of the theory of planned behaviour. And I've just sort of said how the COM-B model for behavioural change and the theory of planned behaviour actually, I think, are pretty much the same model as far as I can see. And they talk about, the COM-B talk about opportunity. So is an attribute of the environmental system that together with capability makes behaviour possible or facilitates it. So this is, are we creating the right context for people to be able to experiment with their behaviours? And this is the same, I think, as the support within the theory of planned behaviour as well. And remember when we did the session on the neuroscience piece, that actually this fits very well with kind of what different parts of the brain are potentially doing when they are contemplating behavioural change. That the hippocampus is drawing up previous memories, your prefrontal cortex is sort of thinking, you know, have I got the willpower to do this? Does it fit with what I want to do? So the hippocampus is asking, can I do it? The prefrontal cortex is saying, do I want to do it? And the sensory cortex is sort of saying, well, looking around and saying, well, are other people do it? And should I give it a go? And is there the support there? Do I see the organisation supporting other people through this? So very crudely, that was me sort of mapping these behavioural models onto the first step that we take, our brains take in whether they're going to contemplate. I'll just quickly go through this, but very crudely, these are the kind of on the left hand side here are the sort of drivers of support, and on the right hand side are kind of outcomes, although it's very difficult pulling these effects apart. But in terms of the model that I've built, these are the kind of relationships that you should start to see. And at the top there, you know, talk about purpose, that if the organisation has clear purpose, and they actually call it value congruent? So do I see the organisation acting in a way that I feel that I can act as well? So is it congruent with my behaviour, their behaviour, or the organisation's behaviour, or others' behaviour? And this is such a complex kind of concept, and I've left it out of this discussion. You might want to go away and look it up separately, but I have read through it, and it's too complicated, not particularly well defined. There aren't any good summaries of evidence on it, so I've kind of put that to one side. But I think it's something we kind of all take for granted, that if the vision is clear and the organisation knows where it's going, and it's clear on its behaviours and expectations, that kind of facilitates change. So we talked about this supervisory support, which we'll talk about in the relationships section, which is a similar concept, but as I said, on this one-to-one kind of relationship. We'll talk a bit about leadership behaviours that drive people's perceptions of organisational support, job quality, sense of autonomy, which is tied into leadership as well. We'll talk about that. And we'll talk about fairness as well, which we talked about in a previous session, and this idea of giving honest feedback. And if we can get that right, then there's more likely to be trust in leadership and the decisions that leadership take. There's more likely to be an improvement in performance. There's more likely to be commitment and lower intention to quit, and positive change evaluations. This is about adaptability, that people feel that they can change and they've got positive emotions about changing, and that they feel involved in their work. And something that we also cover in the model, but is not explicitly in these 16 capabilities, is sense of well-being as well, and we'll talk about that, which is fundamental to organisational support. So if I feel supported, it lowers the stress around change. And we also talk about mediators as well, that usually these kind of constructs, these effects happen through something else, which is why I feel the model that I've built is helpful and important, because it doesn't just say, well, if we do X, Y will happen. X and Y are usually related through other constructs and other things that need to be present. So in this case, organisational support only drives discretionary behaviour or organisational citizenship behaviours if people feel that they can identify with the organisation, and if there's some degree of organisational commitment already there. And similarly, if we want people to perform their tasks differently and improve their performance in a task, which is what organisational change is kind of about as well, then support, if the support is there, then it will work. It will work through feeling of self-efficacy. So people have to feel that they can do, which is, or have got a sense of confidence, which is the theory of planned behaviour model, which we just, and again, some sort of level of commitment to the organisation, and this organisational identification, which is more of a sort of emotional support of the organisation, which I guess is aligned to that thing that we were talking with the organisation. So it kind of works through other things. And also organisational support, perceived organisational support, is so important for getting energy levels up. And I always talk about employee engagement as really referring to employee sort of energy, which is a combination of motivation, commitment, and identification. And social support, like psychological safety, which we talked about in the last session, helps to bind together motivation and commitment. So if I think the organisation is going to support me, I feel more motivated that I can give something a go, and I feel more committed to the organisational cause, and we'll talk about that in detail as well. So this is really just sort of saying that not just change, but generally within organisational development, the importance of caring, really organisations caring and supporting their employees seems to be really sort of hitting the headlines. And it started off back in 2017 in the UK with the publishing of the Taylor review of modern work practices and how people were potentially being exploited who were sort of part of this sort of what was called the gig economy. And so they came through sort of recommendations of how organisations could be better at supporting employees and not just exploiting them. And CIPD have also put in place for a few years now, I think since 2018, this Good Work Index, where they go out and do a huge survey, 3,000 people, and understand whether working conditions within organisations are improving. And as I mentioned on the psychological safety session, we've also got an ISO standard in the UK as well for ensuring that organisations not just take physical safety into account, but psychological safety. And I don't mean, sorry, psychological safety as in, I mean more general sort of psychological health or well-being, sorry. So it is really high on the agenda. And also, I think there's this paradox of that there's virtual working as well. So there's another layer, I guess. You know, we have the gig economy where people are potentially being more exploited, and then we have COVID-19, and then we have people moving to virtual working, which potentially upsets the sort of the normal balance of work and trying to get change done in organizational in organizations. And you know, I explained in one of my posts that we shouldn't be pro or anti virtual working. Virtual working comes with its challenges as equally as it comes with its opportunities. And the opportunities of virtual working, if we get it right, is that it will drive well-being. We know work-life balance, satisfaction, and business flexibility. But we also know there are potential downsides to it, which are, you know, quality of decision making might go down, efficiency might go down, knowledge sharing might go down. However, all the studies that have shown these challenges of working virtually are actually based on students' studies for short-term sort of tasks and not long-term tasks. And in fact, when you look at studies that are just looking at more long-term tasks where people are more committed to their relationships with their colleagues, these challenges become fairly neutral. So in fact, the overall effect of virtual working, and you know, we're still looking for high quality studies on this, is that it will drive perceived organisational support if you get it right, because it's going to drive well-being. So when you go into organisations, I guess, as a change manager, it would be interesting to know how the organisation is dealing with remote working and whether you're trying to do your change on the back of people you know, forcing people to come back into work or whatever it is, because that won't help your cause. The other points that we talked about in neuroscience of organisational change as well was just this point that, well, Lisa Feldman Barrett in her book, How Emotions Are Made, speculates that, you know, anxiety in organisations, so anxiety about change is caused by too much prediction error, where people are trying to second guess what the change is going to be or what's going to happen. So they're predicting, you can see that predicting there, and what they're observing, if it's different, if it's a lot different, then you get this idea of large divergence from the evidence that they're seeing, and that takes a lot of additional energy and potentially, I guess, could result in resistance because people just push back and say, look, this is too exhausting for me, I'm getting too much error. So it's making sure that there is support there, and that that there is a congruent, clear message going out, I guess, that allows people, when they're making their predictions, that then those things are happening. And this comes back to leadership behaviours as well, and how that affects all perceived organisational support. So we'll talk a bit about that as well, and we'll talk about also the effect of anxiety on organisational change and depression, which is caused by these sort of prediction errors potentially. And then just lastly, just this idea around there are lots of different. The reason why this is so complex is because when we're talking about support, or even when we're talking about value congruence, are we talking about my value congruence with my colleague, with my team leader, with somebody in another team, within my team, within the organisation? So this is why it's so difficult to nail all this stuff down. It's because we're talking about relationships and exchange, social exchange at so many different levels. So I don't know if people saw this video before, but I won't play it, but oh, it is going to play. Okay, good. Right. If you can see that, is that playing okay for you? Could you just shout out?
I think it's starting.
It's not. Okay, good. So this is just the idea that that we all basically start. We have a sort of a mechanical, I guess, process that our brains will go through to try and sync our beliefs and our behaviours with others. And this is saying, you know, at a very basic level, these metronomes start to sync with one another. And this is this idea of, sorry, I stopped that before they started syncing, but you can find the video on YouTube. But it's just the idea that in order to understand where we are within the organisation, we have to be able to exchange information. We have to be able to exchange relationships. So we come to this idea of social exchange. And if we can start to exchange how we feel, what our perceptions are, what our values are, what the change is impacting on me, and we see the organisation supporting that, then we create this sort of harmony and syncing, and everything starts moving together. If we don't, then people don't feel a sense of belonging. And if everybody's acting sort of completely autonomously, then the change won't work. So let's just dive. I just wanted to dive a little bit deeper into that idea. And that idea comes from, well, way back, Frederick Taylor emphasised the importance of workers identifying with the organisation's values and strategic goals. So again, this idea of we're all trying to sync together. And then that was, you know, well, not Frederick Taylor, because he obviously wasn't around then or developing these theories, but the theory, really, all these theories originated from this idea of reciprocity, which was developed by Gowder back in 1960, where he's saying that we have these exchange relationships, and originally it started out with money exchange, that, you know, if you pay people to do something, then you know, they'll do it, kind of thing. That's the basis of the relationship. But then they realized, actually, this is more of a social relationship, that if people treat me well, then I'm more likely to feel committed to what the organization wants. So then you get this idea of social exchange emerging in the mid-60s. And then what I find interesting is this idea of organizational personification, that the organization is a person kind of in itself, and it's responsible for the actions of the people who work within it, which I guess is where you get this idea of sort of a toxic working environment, where, you know, the organization itself becomes responsible for the behaviors of others, and you get this sort of this Enron kind of thing going on, you know, where nobody's people are just sort of you start to see these weird antisocial sort of behaviors and horrible behaviors emerging in organizations. But that's an interesting idea, I think. And then we get to more solidifying of this idea of social exchange, which assumes that the basis of social life is this sort of this social exchange, and this creates obligations between people, that if somebody does something for me, I need to do something for them. If my organisation supports me, then I should support the organisation through the change, etc. And then, yeah, further sort of development of this, appreciating contributions. So do organisations value the contribution that I make? And then that develops into this idea of perceived organisational support. And then we get lots of meta-analysis on this, and we find that it reduces turnover, increases job satisfaction, improves commitment to change, and has a positive effect on change interventions. And now, yeah, we're in this world now of where everybody's sort of really interested in this well-being that we talked about before, and the importance of organisations caring for their workers. So very quickly, what we're talking about today is the top part of this diagram, which is the organisational level. The relationship that individuals have with their organisation, not the dyadic relationship that people have with their boss, with their colleagues, or with their team. We're calling that relationships, and we'll talk about that in a separate session. And I appreciate that's a bit complicated, but this is the problem of trying to unpick all of this stuff, is that if we don't nail it down, then I think it makes it more confusing. So this is the perceived organisational support, how people were trying to define it, and I've sort of done a little critique of these. The first one here, the extent that employees perceive their organisation's values as their contributions, and this is this value congruence that we talked about, and cares about their well-being. So that was the first early definition of this, and I think this also relates to organisational justice as well, which was being sort of developed around that time as well. So I wasn't sort of leaning towards that definition, but then you've got this definition of a leader-member exchange, which is this dyadic relationship, what my relationship is like with my boss, as it were. So that's kind of separate, and we'll be talking about that in a separate session. Then you've got this extent to which job provides opportunities for getting assistance and advice from either the supervisor or co-workers. So again, this is perceived organisational support, and I think that's probably maybe the best definition that we have. And then this other one down here, bottom right, employees' beliefs concerning the extent to which the supervisor values their contributions, and I think that's very much leaning towards that leader-manager exchange type definition. So I'm going to go with this definition: the extent to which a job provides opportunities for getting assistance and advice from either supervisors or co-workers, which maybe is also around leader-member exchange as well. So just quickly, this is leader-member exchange, and these are the quality of those dyadic relationships. So it can improve task performance, organisational identification, citizenship behaviours, and counterproductive or reduce counterproductive behaviours, and drive well-being as well. But as I said, we'll talk about that in the relationship one. So what organisational support relies on is the CIPD did this review of organisational support, perceived organisational support, yeah, at a sort of the organisation has to be seen to be there in times of need, which is during change potentially. The organisation needs to, build my confidence and praise me for a job well done. It needs to give me proper feedback, and it needs to give me recognition as well. But it's kind of regardless of the definition that's being used in the previous slide, all the meta-analysis, which are sort of grouping of high quality studies that have been done, confirm that when organisations feel the support from their organisation in times of need and get honest feedback, etc., they're more likely to be committed to change. And this sort of supports this idea of the social emotional needs that people have when they belong to a group, or this sort of sense of belonging as well. So sense of belonging is tied into this, although sense of belonging isn't clearly defined either. And I think perceived organisational support is a sort of part of sense of belonging within organisations. And really, I think from all the literature, it tells us that there are, three types of commitment to change or and organisations. you know, that there's this feeling that I value the change and I want to change, and that's a sort of a feeling that I have, a good feeling that I have. That people feel that they ought to change. I feel obliged to change, so I feel a bit coerced and a bit forced. And you know, the last one that I have to change, and that I have little choice in it. So in a way, they're sort of fearing the change. And so you can see, you know, different people obviously will have different experiences of the change, but if you do have perceived organisational support in there, it's more likely to make people feel like, number one, I want to change, but also for those people who are struggling with the change, who ought to or feel they have to, that it will be easier for them as well, because they know that there is a safety net for them. And if there is a safety net through perceived organisational support, those people may actually, I guess, convert into they want to change, because when they have fallen over or struggled with the change, they see the organisations there and then they're like, well, actually, you know, this is all okay, and I feel I want to change. So that's why I think perceived organisational support, you know, probably works at all three levels. And one thing I found interesting as well from the research was that we talked about these organisational citizenship behaviours, which is what you want from individuals during change, because you're asking them to make extra effort. Generally, change, we don't stop doing stuff, you know, changes in addition to my day job, as it were. So you're asking for discretionary behaviour. And we know that support or social exchange, you know, my organisation is going to support me, so I will commit to the change, drives these discretionary behaviours. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't drive down counterproductive work behaviours, which we might call resistance in sort of normal change management parlance. And I thought this is interesting, because you would have thought that these are two ends of the same scale, but they're, in fact, they're not. So we need different strategies to deal with counterproductive work behaviours, which might be resistance. So people deliberately maybe undermining change. We need different strategies for those people. So organisational support, perceived organisational support, won't necessarily work for those people. So I've realised I've talked a lot. Got that off my chest. I'm feeling a bit more confident about this presentation now. So I'll just open up the floor for you guys, just to give me some feedback or any thoughts that you've had, or anything that's confusing. Or you can type into the messages. I'll open the chat and see if anybody's put any chat in there. Just an apologies that's on today. Hi, Ken. Yeah.
This the presentation, great stuff, right? It's lots of effort gone into it. I can see, huge. What's kind of purpose of it for? Is it something you use with organisations at the moment, or is it something you're trying to build to use to deploy in organisations? Or, you know, I mean, I'm sort of sitting here absorbing all this. It's a great stuff. I'm not sure. It's quite a lot to it, right? To take on board and then apply somewhere. Who's it aimed at?
So what organisational, perceived organisational support?
Yes, the whole kind of thing. You're sort of, this is sort of one sort of topic in a whole range of stuff.
Yeah. So firstly, I think if you're going into an organisation and you're expecting people to change, then I think a fundamental question you need to ask as part of maybe your change readiness questionnaire is, what kind of support mechanisms do you have in place for people who are going through the change? You know, what is your policy on well-being? You know, how do you support people working remotely? How do you hold conversations, or what kind of ways do you sort of engage those people, I guess, in conversations generally online? So, you know, how does the organisation generally support its staff? And if there isn't that support in place, and you run a change program, and you know that you're going to start dialing up levels of anxiety within an organisation, because potentially that's what change does for some people, and there aren't those support mechanisms in place, then your change, I don't think, is going to work as effectively as if you did have those support mechanisms in place. And we're coming on to the how now, how you can do that. But that whole bit that I just presented there was just really a case for how important this is. And arguably, it's probably the most important thing, isn't it? If we think about social exchange, if we think about my organization coming to me and saying, right, I want you to change, your reaction, and we talk about what's in it for me, which is social exchange, is sort of, okay, so how are you going to help me through this? What do I get out of this? Where's the you scratch my and
Yeah.
that is so, and I think people underestimate the power of that. It sounds very transactional, doesn't it?
Yes.
But that's the nature of, that's kind of the nature of work, isn't it, in a way?
Yes, it is. The way we're set up at the moment, it definitely is. Yeah.
Yeah. And if we think about it at a social level, that's kind of the basis for all social relationship. That's kind of what sociology is based on. Is based on living in communities where we exchange, where we exchange. And I know it sounds crude, and I know it doesn't sound very, but it is kind of, if people start doing things that other people don't really like, we know where that ends up. Sorry.
No, good. No, thanks for elaborating. But is this something is this something you kind of, do you actually use this in an organization at the moment, this kind of
so
stuff?
I've used it. Well, the reason that it came, I didn't really think about it that much, but it came to the forefront when I was working in charities, because there's a lot of people expect a lot of discretionary effort in charities, and people put in a lot of discretionary effort because they care so much, but they can care too much, and that affects their well-being. And if organizations don't have support in place, so I was going into these organizations saying, hey guys, we're going to do some change, and they're like, I'm absolutely exhausted. My work, I'm totally committed, and I don't care about what you're doing. So then I thought, well, okay, got to do something about this. Yeah. And people recently have talked about change saturation. I've seen a few posts now, and ADCAR have been posting about change saturation, which has been very much, well, you just need to manage the portfolio of projects, and you need to maybe stop projects. And I don't think that's what it is. I think maybe people can handle the amount of change. They just want to know when they can't handle it, when they do fall over, there's something supporting them, So yeah, I was trying to get ADCAR, when I was arguing with someone about this on LinkedIn, I was trying to get them to think a bit about the person and not about the portfolio. Anyway, sorry, so let me talk about the how. How can we do this? So I'm going to break this down into sort of leadership behaviours, fairness practices, HR practices, what we mean by job quality, and bit about the cultural context. We covered the cultural context in psychological safety, but we'll talk a little bit more about trust. But we talked about trust in the leadership session as well that I run. So please go back to those, because all of these are interrelated. So in terms of leadership, we talk about exchange. I guess people are expecting two elements to build trust, which is this consideration, benevolence, and ability. So am I competent in my work, and do I care about other people, and structure? So some predictability around their work and integrity of their leaders, that they do what they say. And I sort of break this down into the emotional being part and the cognitive doing part, which is how the model is split up. And this is essentially what you need. And the consideration bit is actually the transformational part of leadership. So am I seen to be caring? So the behaviours that we need to get people engaged in organisational change is the transformational piece. And in order to run the change day to day, we need to have the transactional leadership piece, which is the sort of process focused. So you've got this sort of person focus and people focus. So that's the sort of the balance there between, I guess, the structure and giving people agency. The the structure of giving people predictability and integrity, but the agency as well of making people feel that they can change through these sort of benevolent attitudes from leaders, that they will be there to pick people up when they sort of fall down, kind of thing. And then back on this agency structure piece in terms of organisational fairness, and we deep dived into this in the fairness session, is that when you are going through a change process and you are going through this procedure and we're going to agree the change, then is that process deemed to be fair? Are the outcomes of that change, if we're going through redundancy, are the outcomes of that change seen to be fair? So that's the distributed fairness. And then we get the sort of informational and interpersonal parts as well. So do people feel they're being treated fairly? Is their voice being heard? Are explanations provided? So if we're doing this, people will feel that the organisation is supporting them, is listening to them, is being fair in the way that it's making decisions. And also, organisational fairness is related to the trust in leadership as well. So I'm more likely to trust leaders who go through this procedural process. And these two things have two different effects. So procedural and distributed fairness create structure around the change. So is the decision-making process in the change fair? That creates structure, and that drives job satisfaction, commitment to the change, trust in the organisation, and ultimately performance. And the agency bit, am I being consulted on the change? Do I feel that I have been given skin in the game? Drives change commitment, these organisational citizenship behaviours, and drives perceived organisational support as well. So if you're listening to people, people are more likely to believe that the organisation is supporting them or will support them. And then there's this model as well around, which I think is really sort of around social exchange. It's called a job demand resources model, and this is a model that sort of predicts well-being within organisations, but it's basically saying that we have demands in our jobs and we have resources that we can pull on, and the demands are, sort of crisis management, poor leadership, poor decision-making processes, people criticising each other, unrealistic targets. So these could all be symptomatic of the change that you're running. But if we can counterbalance that with, proper support mechanisms, clear role, clarity, a sense of autonomy, we talked about psychological safety, rewards for their work. So in every job, there's always these demands and resources. So again, when you go into an organisation, you're asking people to commit to change, then are you tipping that scale on the demand side, or are you tipping that scale on the resources side, or is it, is it sort of balanced? And employees, are constantly making these sort of calculations. This is the social exchange. Is the organisation demanding too much of me? Am I willing to give discretionary effort to make this change happen, or is this just sort of like a step too far? And in these studies as well on perceived organisational support, there's also a difference if you're working in different parts of the world between East and West. And I thought this is interesting that more sort of Eastern side behaviours within organisations is that perceived organisational support is more strongly correlated with the identification that people have with the organisation. So it's more of a relational, perceived organisational support is seen to be more relational, whereas in the West, it's more likely to drive ideas around social exchange. So in the West, it's more likely to be transactional. That if you're giving me something, then if you're asking something of me, then I want something in exchange. So in the West, if you're doing change in the West, then people want to see that exchange process. Whereas maybe in the East, if you're trying to get perceptions of organisational support up, it's going to be more relational. It's going to be more based on, do I identify with the organisation as a whole and the people within it. And then there's this this model as well, just to sort of try and pull everything together to say that, you know, that if we want people to feel included and part of the change, we want to have this sort of inclusive culture, then we have to get this balance right between belonging and uniqueness. And social support helps with this and creates this as well. So social support, you know, will create cohesion, but social support also, sort of perceived organisational support, will also help people feel a sense of autonomy, that they can express themselves within the organisation. So it gets this balance right between going with the flow and going with the change, but also feeling that I have a say or skin in that change. And then I just thought I'd throw this in because people talk about so perceived organisational support in change is trying to prevent you know, burnout, and is trying to maintain well-being, and is trying to create resilience to change as well. But actually, all these things are very similar when you're looking the words for the different metrics, or the different, surveys that are used to measure these things. So the work engagement scale, the burnout inventory, WHO5, these are all questions taken from those scales, and they all measure the same thing, which is around, do I have the emotional, cognitive, physical support from the organisation? So if I do expend energy, am I going to get something in return, i.e. support, which will stop me from burning out? And I'll skip over that because that's very sort of experimental. So I think as part of your change readiness process, and I posted this on LinkedIn as well, I think you should be doing some kind of understanding of what current energy levels are, or current well-being levels are within the organisation. And so I would recommend using WHO5. There's 5 questions there. But also you might want to understand what anxiety levels are within the organisation. Particularly when I was working in charity, some people are going to be really right on the cusp of being very anxious about change, because they've just run out of energy, and so that GAD-7 generalized anxiety disorder scale, there's questions in there that you can use. And sorry, just to go back, I'll just test this out on you, that anxiety is different from depression. So I'm feeling anxious, it means that I'm always I'm always making predictions, but none of those predictions are becoming right. So I'm trying to predict the future, i.e. what this change is going to happen, what change is going to happen. But my predictions keep on failing, or they keep on getting it wrong. So what people say is going to happen doesn't happen, or I try to adopt behaviours that I think are the right behaviours, but then my supervisor tells me off because they're not the right behaviours, or they don't fit in with what other people are doing. And this is because people are struggling to update their mental models, and they're not learning, and so that creates anxiety. That's different from depression, because depression is when I look backwards, and I'm the experiences that I've constructed from the past, I are unable to predict what's going on now. So depression is about prediction error in the past, trying to understand what's going on now. Anxiety is about predicting into the future and trying to get things right. And this is a model that I'm trying to adapt from how emotions are made. But I think it's an important distinction, because it helps us as change agents to understand the difference, but it also helps us to move to, how do we get people to be adaptive? And we get people to be adaptive by, when they predict something's going to happen, we make sure that it happens. So if we say something's going to happen in a meeting, or these are the kind of behaviours, that when they do exhibit those behaviours, they are the right behaviours. And also they're getting the right learning to help them adapt as well. So and that helps people to then reinforce and accept the change better than if their predictions are wrong, then they'll start withdrawing from the change. So that was just to say, yeah, you can use this anxiety scale to check whether people are very particularly anxious about the change. And this is how I measure organisational support within the model. And it's asking, does the organisation really care about my well-being? Is the organisation willing to help me when I need a special favour? So if I need special dispensation, is that going to be granted? And the organisation cares about my opinions, which is that organisational fairness. So is my voice being listened to? Do I feel I have skin in the game? And then there's this sort of value congruence piece as well a bit, which is, do the goals of the change align to my goals, and do I feel confident that I can change, which is that sort of self-efficacy as well. Yeah, and then, sorry, this is where I start to get a bit, in summary, I guess, the benefits of this is that, you'll get increased commitment to change. It'll drive trust. You'll get these increasing organisational citizenship behaviours. One study which I found, which I thought was quite interesting as well, is that if the organisation is seen to be supporting, then that also helps to compensate for negative personality traits that you might see during change. So people who are just generally got a bit of a downer on change, if they see the organisation is going to support them, then that will help to sort of compensate for those negative behaviours. And I think also there's this idea of, do we just say that we support people and then assume that people will say, okay, well, they will support me, so I'll get and try on this behaviour? Or do you have to actively demonstrate that the support is in place before people actually believe you? And I'm becoming quite a strong believer in the behaviour has got to come before the belief, that people have got to see leaders acting in a certain way, or the organisation acting in a certain way, before individuals will feel that they have the self-efficacy to try stuff out. So there's no point in just running maybe a fancy communication plan about some meditation sessions that we're running to help people with their well-being. People want to see more than that. They want to see, okay, what does this really mean? And that's, I guess, the strength of that exchange relationship. And I just sort of just came up with this process as well, which is meant to help individuals or maybe organisations drive up perceived organisational support from all the different models that I've seen. And that's the sort of what I call the real ears here model, which is just basically saying that we should start off with this relationship side. And remember, for countries in the East, this is probably a good place to start, and a good place to start with anybody, reflecting, inquiring, giving your full attention and listening to people who you're expecting to change, and then moving up into showing them empathy, sort of accepting when they don't get things quite right, reframing behaviours, and sharing your own experiences as well, showing that vulnerability, and then honouring, which is more the sort of performance level, where people are really delivering on the behavioural change and experimenting with different behaviours, and they're being appreciated for their behavioural change and being recognised for that, which is part of the perceived organisational support. And yeah, sorry, I'm going to skip through this because we're running out of time. But this is just sort of reiterating that attention, reflecting, inquiring, listening. And there's been quite a bit of research on this around active listening and how you can be seen to be empathetic as an organisation and as a manager, so that people perceive that you will give them support. So that's just a model there. So just very quickly, in summary, I always talk about these above the line and below the line behaviours. So for managers, if you see, sort of avoidance, you see silence in meetings, disengagement, the change isn't worth it, it's too much effort, and people generally feel demotivated, it's probably, well, one of the reasons could be that people don't feel that there's perceived organisational support. But if you talk to people and they feel that the change is aligned to their personal goals, and you'll see reduced turnover, you'll see more commitment to change, and positive change evaluation as well. People will start to see how it's going to benefit them, and you'll get some sort of psychological attachment to the change. People get more emotionally attached to it. People speaking up, people feeling they've got skin in the game, and people being vulnerable with each other. And these citizenship behaviours is, people helping each other out, people coaching each other, and going the extra mile. So there's sort of behaviours that you'll see. So that's it. 1 minute to spare. If there are any questions, was that helpful? Did that help, or is that?
Well, it always helps to make you think, Alex. So thank you very much for taking the effort to take us through it. No, for me, it's I always take all these things on board. It's very good. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Great, thank you.
I want to thank you. I want to thank you as well, Alex. And it really makes sense from what we're seeing in organizations, because I'm working with like 5 organizations at the same time, and you're right, they're only doing meditation, meditation courses, or what they're doing, and they believe it's well-being, is they're offering online psychological support with cognitive behavioral therapy, but that's the only thing I'm seeing. So, and they're not looking at.
Lost.
Sorry, I have a really slow connection. They're not looking at.
Sorry, Sophia, I missed your.
Is this better if I take the camera away?
Yeah, I'll do the same actually, because my connection here.
My connection is really bad here, but I'm not seeing anyone. Well, I don't want to say anyone because it's generalizing, but I'm not seeing. They're not measuring things like burnout, even though they have at hand really good scales, or organizational support. So it's really interesting, Alex. Thank you very much. I'm taking this to redesign some programs that we're doing.
Brilliant, good. Well, that would be great if it's had that effect. I just think that, we don't, in organisational change or change management, we don't talk about this enough. I think people talk about the people side of change, but we don't actually talk about the levels of anxiety, how we measure anxiety, how we try and improve well-being, how we try and make change a comfortable ride for people. And I just thought this was an interesting concept that might help with that. So good luck, and come back and tell me how you got on.
Thank you very much. Yes, I will. I'm sorry I have to run, but thank you, and I'll try to make my best to be in the next one. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sophia. Thanks, Ken.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
cheers.
Bye. Chat with you another time, Alex, about some of this. It'd be interesting to have another chat just to get to know you a bit better. Actually, I've been coming along to a few of your things, but I still, perhaps when you're back off holidays, you can have a chin wag.
Yeah, could you just put your email again in there, and I'll send you a link to my calendar, and we could just, that'd be great.
Here's my email.
Hang on, I'll turn the recording off actually.
There you
go. Brilliant. What's Bump Conductor then? Is that your company name, or?
Yeah, I'll tell you what I'm doing. So Bump Conductor, what I do at the moment to make money, I do sort of consultancy in technology, basically. So like, I'm a I guess I'm an architect or a software engineer, whatever lens you want to put on it sometimes. But the way what I've been doing over the last 7 years, Bump Conductor is if you want me to give you the sort of short story, I'm interested in finding better ways to help people solve problems. That's where it sort of started off from. And Bump Conductor is the name I've given to a problem-solving kind of engine, right? A bit like I took the name from like the flux capacitor from Back to the Future, which is like a time machine.
Yeah.
And problem conductor is like the equivalent for problem solving. So, and that sounds a bit weird, but anyway, that's where the name come from, bump conductor. And BUMP stands for big unsolved meaningful problems.
Oh, I like that.
And if you want to check out what I'm doing, I'm developing a social network for shared problem solving. And that's what I'm doing. I kind of, my concept is to have